Nothing to do with the names of the men who were being convicted, but the cases that fitted that model. And we came up in the end with 17 cases since the late 90s, 13 different towns and cities, 56 men convicted. 3 of the 56 were white, 53 were Asian names, 50 of them were Muslim names, and when we looked into each case, the overwhelming majority were Pakistani Muslim. Okay, so we had our kind of evidential base, but what the hell are you going to do about it? We needed to start talking to people, and so I tried to start talking to police forces, to specialists, to experts who look after children, to government departments, and there was a complete wall of silence. All we get, if anything, was a terse statement, you know, ethnicity, culture has absolutely no relevance whatsoever to this pattern of offending. In the end, I found one small charity which worked with the families of victims, and through them I got to know some of the families and to understand that the court cases where people were actually being prosecuted were actually a tiny, tiny minority, because in most cases parents had been trying really hard to get help for their kids. They were going and knocking on doors, they were pleading with social services, with police to do something, and nothing was happening. I was called down to London for my very first ever one-to-one meeting with the editor of the Times. I thought we'd done it, but he said we were going to carry on running stories about this. You're going to carry on writing about this until we're satisfied that every public body in England has the knowledge and systems in place to protect children and prosecute offenders, however long it takes. Well, it took 4 years. We told more individual family stories. One of the very first was from a grandfather who rang from Rotherham, who wanted to talk about his granddaughter. 1 month after her 13th birthday, she'd gone to school and then gone missing, and the school had rung her mum, who'd immediately rung the police, who'd said, "Don't worry, love, she'll turn up as soon as she gets hungry." She didn't turn up that afternoon, that evening, and at 2:30 in the morning, the next morning, a woman on the other side of Rotherham had picked up the phone and dialed 999 because she'd heard a young girl screaming in the house next door. Police had gone round to the house. They found this 13-year-old girl with another young girl. She was almost completely naked, she was blind drunk, and she was with 7 adult Pakistani men. She was drunk and leery. And South Yorkshire Police arrested the 13-year-old girl for being drunk and disorderly. They took her back to the station, put her in the cells, eventually charged her, and she was convicted. They didn't even question the men as to why they were in a house with a 13-year-old girl who was nearly naked in the early hours of the morning. Another early story was about Rochdale, and in the spring of 2012 came the first big court case we covered. By now, this pattern and this story was getting quite a lot of attention, but there were still many days when we were the only newspaper in court. It was a trial that lasted several weeks, and on one of those days, we learned something pretty extraordinary. One of the victims was a girl from Essex, but she'd been put into a children's home in Rotherham, and she was the only resident of that children's home. I'd never heard of solo care children's homes. In 2 months in that home, she'd gone missing 15 times, periods ranging from a day to a fortnight, and on one of those missing nights, she'd been taken to a house, put blind drunk in an upstairs bedroom, and cars had started arriving from all across Greater Manchester. Men were queuing on the stairs and on the landing outside the bedroom, and the jury heard that 50 men had had sex with that girl in one night. She was a child. When I looked into this children's home, it turned out that Rochdale had more than 40 solo care homes, each supposedly offering specialist 24/7 care to one child. Essex County Council was paying more than £250,000 a year to place that child there. We discovered a whole pattern of private care companies, many of them owned by private equity firms, buying very cheap properties in the north and the Midlands. And vulnerable kids were being shipped up from London and the southeast. Private companies were charging extortionate prices. And these kids were being placed, many of them right smack bang in the middle of sex grooming hotspots. That story is just one example of some of the spin-offs that came along the 4 years, but it led to an urgent government review, a significant shake-up of children's home regulations. By now, more and more criminal inquiries were being launched, but I kept coming back to Rotherham because something about what the police had done in that house really troubled me. We told and got to know some families so well in that town, and I got to know the case files, and it just seemed extraordinary that the authorities knew so much and did so little. I couldn't work out if it was just these isolated cases I was hearing about or whether it was something more. And eventually came the big breakthrough for the investigation, without question the most single important day, which was the day I drove to an address somewhere in South Yorkshire. I waited and eventually another car drove up. I opened my boot, the driver opened theirs, and two very large sagging cardboard boxes were transferred from their car to mine. Inside those boxes were hundreds of confidential documents. Internal papers, police intelligence reports, social services case files. Those papers gave us the chance to tell a very detailed and damning story, how for more than a decade South Yorkshire Police and Rotherham Council had known exactly what was happening. They knew the girls, they knew the names of the men, their nicknames, their home addresses, their car registration numbers, the places they were taking these children, and they had effectively sat back, shrugged their shoulders and done nothing. In my naivety, I thought that when we published that story in September 2012, those at the top of those two organisations would be so shocked and ashamed and horrified that they would immediately announce inquiries to try to get to the bottom of what had happened. Rotherham Council was indeed horrified, and an inquiry was launched, but not into their own failings. All they wanted to know was how we'd got hold of the documents. They'd already tried to get a High Court injunction to block an earlier story. Now they asked the police to launch a criminal inquiry into the leak. They also hired a firm of solicitors to investigate the security breach. As for the police, they not only dismissed all criticism, but publicly accused the Times of exploiting the victims. Those authorities were in complete denial, so we kept digging, and a year later, in August 2013, we published the story that eventually shamed the council into commissioning the independent inquiry, whose report was published in August last year. Rufus was telling you about it. It wasn't just the numbers, 1,400 children, it was the clear evidence the inquiry had found of horrific crimes having been ignored or suppressed by the authorities. As Rufus said, suddenly Rotherham became headline news globally. China, Australia, Canada, you name it. And when I think back to what the editor said to me 4 years ago, we're going to keep on until, the council's chief executive told a parliamentary committee in evidence that the reason the council felt forced to commission that inquiry that ended up having such huge repercussions was because, quote, the Times wouldn't leave us alone. In the outcry that ensued, several senior people lost their jobs. Then the ruling Labour cabinet resigned en masse. Finally, the local authority was found not fit for purpose, and it's now run by a team of government-appointed commissioners. I think this story is an example of why newspapers matter. For years and years, people in that town had been desperately concerned by what was going on. They'd tried their very best to raise the alarm. Young girls and their families had pleaded with the police. Frontline workers told their bosses. Internal reports were written, seminars held, letters sent to chief constables, MPs, government departments, and absolutely nothing changed. And finally, when all else failed, someone very brave decided in desperation to place their trust in journalism. Those documents I was handed revealed something shameful, something people in power, people whose job it supposedly was to protect children, had chosen to keep safely hidden. It was, for obvious reasons, a very uncomfortable story to put on the front page of a national newspaper, but it was true. And sometimes it really is the uncomfortable truths that are the ones it's most important for journalists to tell, because if we don't, no one else will. On my own, I could have done exactly the same work as I've done these past 5 years, and it would have achieved precisely nothing. I could have posted blogs, I could have stood and shouted on street corners. It wouldn't have changed anything. But this wasn't me alone. This was the Times.
I am Amar Khan, and I am the founder and president of American Friends of Balochistan. We have been suffering under Pakistani military oppression, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes in 5 different uprisings against the terrorist state of Pakistan. We have been trying to tell the world that Pakistan is a terrorist entity long before 9/11 happened. I had been trying to make the American people aware that Pakistan is not a friend of the West. Pakistan is the person who is like the person who takes the money from the US but sleeps with China. So she has been like that entity for a long time. Pakistan is also the favorite destination for what you call jihad tourism. So you might have seen, you are in the United Kingdom, a significant chunk of global jihadi terrorists, I am very sorry to say, are today in the United Kingdom, and the huge percentage of that is of Pakistan origin. And I do share the concern of the local British people about what is happening in that country. You can see that they come and block your roads to say prayers. You can see that they come and try to enforce their way of life in a society where they are a minority. Now you can imagine what kind of atrocities we are facing, where they are the dominant majority. We are languishing under the boots of the Pakistan military and the ISI. Our people are being killed like as if we were ants and flies. They are violating the human dignity of the Baloch living man and of the Baloch dead. Unimaginable, unconscionable acts of terror against the Baloch individual. The West must rise for us. We have our hope on the West. The West knows human dignity. They have their values. They have their institutions. They have their parliament. They believe in freedom of the individual. It's called the R2P, responsibility to protect.
Why is it we hear so much about Palestine, we hear so much about Rohingya Muslims, but we're not hearing anything about yourselves?
Yeah, the thing is, you'll be surprised. I have a strong Burma connections also. I was born in Rangoon. Okay. So I know a lot about Rohingya. Rohingya, just as I said, in your country, a minority tries to come and dominate their way of life on the majority. That has been happening in Burma for the last many decades. The reason why Rohingya issue is such a big issue is because they have Saudi money behind it, and they have the ISI planning behind it. ISI is involved very deeply in that issue.
ISI is Pakistani intelligence?
ISI is the Pakistani version of the CIA, as they call it. So it is the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Pakistan Army. They have got more than 150,000 agents, including 18,000 agents on the social media who also bother you all the time. I know.
You see that? You see their intelligence?
18,000 paid ones. 18,000 ISI on the Twitter, on Instagram, and on Facebook.
That explains all my trolls.
Yeah. So now you see they were trying to project you as if you are anti-human, you are as if you are Islamophobic and all that. We have been following that, and when we listened to one of your speech at one of the universities you did about 3 or 4 years ago, that was very moving speech you delivered, and we saw it that the words that you were speaking was coming out from your heart. So when you face fascism, when you face Islamofascism, then there must not be a difference between the right and left. All people should unite when it comes to facing Islamofascism that we are seeing. In your parliament, you have got some people who are more Pakistani than British. What is this nonsense? Why can some of your politicians be more Pakistani than British? This is something ridiculous. And how come, and I'm sometimes very upset, you see, with some of your very liberal people. They are, you see, they try to justify this. They try to say, no, this is all right. This is not all right. When a member of parliament goes in bed with the Pakistani intelligence services, it means they are harming the British national interest. They are putting British lives in jeopardy. They are endangering the lives of Britain's future. Britain might have done something very wrong in the past when it was a colonial power. That doesn't mean that the British today should pay a price for that. Son should never pay a price for the father's sins.
Imam Tweedy is one of the world's leading imams and a highly regarded scholar of the Quran and Islamic history. He's nicknamed the Imam of Peace. He is known for his outspoken and honest discussion of the culture and ideological problems within the religion. I want to sit down with him to learn more about the true history of Islam. Welcome to UK, Imam Tweedy.
Thank you very much, brother.
And for the people who are just watching this who don't know who you are, you have probably become the most famous imam in the world for people, I'd say, that are on our side of the circle. Do you want to explain to them why that is? Or do you want me to explain why it is?
Well, I'd like you to explain it from your point of view.
I'll say from my point of view, you've become the first religious imam that has come out and said what I think many of the times needs to be said. You talk about taking violent passages out of the scripture. You challenge the scripture. And yeah, it's really, because we first had contact when I was leading the English Defence League. And even when we had that contact then, I was surprised, if I'm honest, because I'm leading the biggest street protest movement against Islam at the time. Every Muslim leader was very critical. You wasn't. More so, you sort of reached out at that time, talking openly. Yeah.
Indeed. I travelled to Iran, where I was born originally, but we migrated to Australia. I went back to Iran in 2006, and I engaged in my studies. And during my studies, I saw a lot of corruption within the political system of how the Islamic governments control the students and what they study, which at the end leads to missionaries coming to the West from these Islamic governments, being trained and funded. And I was once upon a time one of these missionaries that would be sent around the world to Canada and so on to preach Sharia law, spreading the caliphate under different names, Islamic government, or and even Sharia courts and so on. When I saw this corruption, I criticized them. I paid a very heavy price, interrogations, prisons. And then
in Iran? You was in prison in Iran?
Yes.
For challenging it in 2006?
Yes.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
And it was actually 2012.
2012, okay.
Yes, in Iran. And I moved to Iraq, and I got involved in a few media projects. And then after I saw that my presence in Iraq is actually silencing a lot of what I can do, I moved out to the West and I started using social media to criticize the corruption.
Okay. And that's when we spoke in 2012.
Yes.
Because even when you spoke to me then, you received backlash. Yeah?
Indeed. And I was very surprised to see your approach, because I knew that there are people that hate Islam and Muslims, but you were approaching the whole situation from a very political perspective, and you were very different from other people. Like even when there were people that would go out and cause violence, I saw you to be a bit more different. You came out on television and you knew what you were talking about.
Yeah.
And that encouraged me to reach out to you. And I think we spoke about terminologies and how you could win a lot of my type of Muslims over by directing the blame onto Wahhabis and Salafis rather than other small minorities.
Yeah, because that's, I gathered very, so you were a Shia.
Yes.
And you said a lot of our problems, which I have many Shias tell me this, but then I have many Sunnis say the opposite. So I have many Shias who would say to me that, that what you're angry about is the Salafists, it's the Wahhabists, it's the Saudis. That's what I should be angry about. That's the problems that I see, and that, and that's pretty much, I think, at the time what you was getting at.
Yes, but there were other things that I didn't tell you because I was living within those areas and my communications could be monitored. The Shia also have problems with Hezbollah and the Iranian regime, and we've seen what they've been doing lately. So yeah, I think it's more of terminologies that, if used properly, can actually lead to better results when clashing with them in the media or even on diplomatic level.
You know it was a joke. You're a journalist, you know it was a joke, but you push an agenda which you don't even agree with yourself. Was it a joke? Do you think it was a joke? Why can't you answer that question?
Is this a tough ruling by the EDL?
Why can't? No, it's not the EDL. I left the EDL 5 years ago. But anyway, do you think it was a joke?
Is this a tough ruling by the former leader of the EDL?
Well, is that some sort of dig? Yeah, the former leader of the EDL who had to try and make...
I'm asking you a question.
Okay, yes.
The same as you're asking me a question.
Yes, I'll answer it simply in the yes. Do you think it was a joke? Do you think the video was a joke?
I was covering a court case.
Why don't you just answer the question?
I was covering a court case.
Why can't you answer the
Sky
question?
News.
Why can't you answer the question?
I'm a neutral journalist.
Why can't you answer the
in
question?
court, I report it.
Okay.